Continuing the series of videos in my JavaScript and Node.js for Complete Beginners course. In this video, we're going to start looking at loops in JavaScript, and we're going to look at the very common while loop, which is a kind of loop. So I've created this file while.js, and if you are a complete beginner, this is a kind of exciting step, because when you start using loops, that's the point at which you really leverage the power of programming to automate things. So instead of typing something in your code like 5 times or even 50 million times, which would be really impossible, nearly, you can get the JavaScript interpreter to output, let's say, some text or to execute some code as many times as you want. Let's start off by writing use strict. Doesn't matter what kind of quotes I use, double or single, but I'll try to use single because I actually think they look nicer in JavaScript. So the first thing we need is a variable, so we're going to execute some code repeatedly, and we need to keep track of how many times we've run that code so far. So I'm going to create a variable called counter. Let's write let counter equal, and I'm going to initially set it to 0. And then we're going to write while. So while is a keyword, and after that we have a pair of round brackets, and after that I'll put a space in because I think it looks nice, and we open a curly bracket, and Visual Studio Code has actually put the closing curly bracket in for me. I just hit return, and that lines up with the left margin, which is exactly where we want it. So we want a construct that looks like this, and you may recognize this to an extent even if you're a total beginner, because it's the same as what we have for an if statement. And as with an if statement, we're going to put a condition in here, and we're going to put some code between these curly brackets here. These curly brackets and the code inside them that we're going to put inside them, that's called a code block. So let's suppose we want to output some text exactly 3 times. We can write here while counter less than 3. And within the loop, we're going to increase the value of counter. So I could write counter equals counter plus 1. Now every time this executes, it's going to increase the value of counter by 1. And this sometimes confuses beginners because it looks like we're saying counter is equal to counter plus 1, which seems impossible unless counter is infinite, I suppose. Maybe then it's possible, I don't know. But you have to remember that this is the assignment operator. What it does is it takes whatever is on the right hand side and it assigns that value or stores it in this variable on the left here. So we're assigning a new value to counter, which is equal to counter plus 1. So if counter is 0, then 0 plus 1 gives us 1, and it stores that value in counter, so the new value of counter becomes 1. We can actually write this in a shorter way just by writing counter plus plus. It does the same thing. It increments the value of counter. It adds 1 to it. So what does this whole thing do? Let's first put in some text. So we can, before we increment counter here, we can put in as many lines of code as we want, and they will be executed repeatedly. I'll just put in some blank lines just to make it a bit clearer. Let's write console.log hello semicolon. So the JavaScript, or the Node.js interpreter in this case, is going to read down, we declare counter, and then we hit this while keyword, and it says, okay, is this condition true? If it is, then it's going to execute whatever is in this code block here. When it's finished executing it, it's going to go back to the beginning, go back to the while keyword, that is, and it will ask again, is this condition true? And if it is, it will execute the code block again. It keeps doing that until it finds that the condition is false. When the condition is false, it's no longer true, then it won't execute this. It will go on to whatever is after that in the program. Let's write console.log finished. And this may seem confusing if you're a beginner, but the thing is to try it out and play with it a bit yourself. So let's run it now. I'm going to write node while.js, and we see we've got 3 hellos exactly, and then it says finished. So if you just practice this a little bit, you should be able to figure out how to output some text exactly the number of times that you want. Notice it's not going to work if we don't increment counter here. That's a vital working part of it. It's quite common to forget that. So when you're writing while loops, I recommend putting that in right at the start before you start filling in code that you want to execute in the loop. If we comment this out here and I try to execute it, I haven't actually tried this, but let's try it. Then it's an infinite loop. I have to stop it with Control-C, which stops programs executing in the bash shell. So we don't normally want infinite loops. Well, we always have to have some way of ending the loop normally. So you have to remember all the different bits of this. So it can seem a bit counterintuitive that we're saying while counter is less than 3, and yet we want to output, or we want to execute whatever code is in here 3 times. And the reason for that is that counter starts at 0. So we have 0, 1 and 2. Those are the iterations of the loop, the values of the counter for those iterations. So to sort of show what I mean here, if I write comma counter in console.log so that we output the value of counter, I'll just clear my console. If I run that, we can see that counter takes the value 0, 1 and 2. And then when it gets to the value 3, this condition is false. Counter is no longer less than 3. It's false. So it doesn't execute that. It just goes on and does the rest of the program afterwards, as you can see. So if you're a beginner, you definitely need to practice this a little bit. I'm going to give you an exercise in the next video, but you have to. I would recommend practicing this before you go on to that video, because otherwise the exercise it may be too hard. Practice it a little bit. It's really not difficult. It can look confusing at the start. You just need a little bit of practice with it, and you should be able to output whatever text you like exactly however many times you like. Okay, so we'll leave it there for this video. Until next time, happy coding. And this is a tutorial on for loops, continuing my course on JavaScript and Node.js for beginners. So a for loop is probably the most common type of loop used in programming in general. Many of the constructs that we've seen, and generally most or all of the ideas that we've seen really, are found in a variety of programming languages with small differences between them. And a for loop is one of those things that's ubiquitous in a wide range of programming languages. And a for loop takes all the elements that you need to create a loop and basically puts them into a single construct. So if we think how we might write a while loop, so there are lots of ways to write while loops, but one common way would be to create a counter, set it equal to 0, and say while counter is less than 5 or whatever, and within the loop you have to increment counter. And we've seen this already. So if I do console.log and just output counter there, then let's run this. So if I write node and for.js, then we get output 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's just bring this up a little bit. Okay. So if you look at what elements are here, now they don't all have to be present. None of them have to be present actually to create a while loop. If you were to write while, like while true, that would be an infinite loop, and then you could have some way of breaking it inside the loop. So one way is to use the break keyword. I could write, let's maybe take a quick look at that. So I could write while true, and I'll still increment the counter, but here I'll say if counter is greater than or equal to 5, break. So the break keyword breaks a loop. Let's just take a look. Let's just run this. And we get 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So 5 iterations in total. Worth trying that out for yourself. And the point here that I'm making is that none of these loop elements are essential. Nevertheless, the most common way to write a while loop might be something similar to this. And you don't even have to say while counter is less than 5. You could say, set the counter to 10 and say while counter is greater than 0, and then decrement the counter with minus minus here. So there are lots of possibilities, but the important point is that there are 3 distinct parts to this, 3 distinct working parts. We've got a variable that we've created, which we've initialized in this case to 0. We've got a condition somewhere, typically here, that determines when the loop stops. And we also increment the counter, or we could decrement it depending on exactly how we're doing this loop. Now, a for loop brings all those 3 different parts together, and it looks like this. So an infinite for loop would look like this. So we write for, and again we have round brackets and we have curly brackets. So this is the same as a while loop, except we've got the for keyword. And within these 2 brackets we need 2 semicolons like this, which looks weird, but you'll see why shortly. If I just write console.log in there, let's output hello. This is an infinite loop. So if I run this, it just goes on forever till I do Control C and stop it. But these 2 semicolons divide this area up into 3 sections, where we can put the 3 elements that we need of our loop. So the first thing that we need is a loop counter. And by the way, it's really common to use really short variable names for loop counters, especially in this situation. And it's actually particularly common to use I, or if you've got another one, you need another one, maybe J, maybe K. So in general, we avoid short cryptic variable names, but when you use I in a loop, everyone understands what it means. So I'm going to write let I equals 0 here. Now this first section here will actually run before the loop starts. So that gives us an opportunity to declare and initialize a variable. This second section here, that's where we put the loop condition. So this will be checked every time one iteration of the loop executes. And as soon as the condition is no longer true, the loop stops. So let's write I less than 5. And then this third section here, this is going to get run every time the loop iterates. So after every iteration, this section will get run. Let's put I++. So if you think how this is going to work now, before the loop starts, we declare this variable I and we initialize it to 0. And every time the loop goes round, we are going to increment this variable I, increase the value of it by 1, and then we're going to check. We're going to see, is it still less than 5? If it is, do another iteration of the loop. If it isn't, stop the loop. So let's actually output the value of I here as well and run this. I'll just zoom out. And we can see we've got hello, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So 5 iterations of the loop, because we keep going as long as I is less than 5, and we're starting I at 0, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. If you're new to this, the thing is just to practice this. Copy it from the video here or from my GitHub repository, where you can find that at github.com/caveofprogramming, and then just go to the repository for Node.js and JavaScript. And a really good thing to do is just to try it a few times and then try to write it without referring to any code. So don't see if you can write it from memory in other words. And then practice. Just make sure that you can write a for loop that executes any particular number of times that you want, like 3 times, 2 times, 10 times, whatever. So try it out, and once you can do that, you've basically got the hang of it. So it looks a little bit complicated at first to a complete beginner, but you know, it's just a little bit of stuff to remember. It's not absolutely not obligatory to put these things in these different sections here. The point of them is just that you have a section that runs before the loop starts. You have a condition that's checked before every iteration of the loop, and you have a thing that runs before every iteration of the loop, except for the first one. Well, actually, I suppose it's better to say this runs after every iteration of the loop, and this condition is checked before the loop executes. So you can put what you like in these 3 sections, and sometimes programmers get a bit creative with them, but that can get very unclear. So that the clearest thing to do is to do stuff like this, and if you've got other code, put it somewhere else. But nevertheless, it isn't uncommon to see other stuff in here as well. Okay, so until next time, happy coding.